Okay, we'll throw it open to questions. Go ahead.
A question to Nelly, if I may. First, what establishes Hanoun as the authority to define what Al-Qaeda is? Well, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Second, the distinction, or rather the dichotomy between religiosity, minimum, and militancy, maximum, puzzles me, because certainly this can't be such a dichotomy. It begs the question, militancy on behalf of what? Certainly not for its own sake, but there must be some purpose behind it. Isn't that continuously defined by some sense of religiosity?
Thank you. Well, what establishes him as an authority? I'm not claiming that he is an authority. I am just drawing the attention to the fact that he is an operational figure. He's been trusted by the leadership, and this is the account that he has given us is his understanding of Al-Qaeda as he experienced it both during the training as well as during the operational side. It's full of stories, it's full of anecdotes. There are certain inconsistencies, but I think it's a very important perspective for us to look at Al-Qaeda from the operational side. For somebody who is in his position telling us what Al-Qaeda is, we really need to pay attention to that side, since Al-Qaeda is, after all, about the operational part of it. So whether he's an authority is another matter, but I think it's a compelling account that cannot be ignored. On the question of religiosity versus militancy, I think both from his own account and from the documents, the Harmony documents that I have read, you can really appreciate the minimum religiosity of Al-Qaeda when you start reading what the rest of the jihadi landscape's religiosity is about. And Haroun tells us that Peshawar, when he set his foot in Peshawar, it was littered with with theological obsessions and so on and so forth. You can tell. So those who have actually accused Al-Qaeda of being takfiri, he relates several anecdotes where Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri, Abu Hafs al-Masri, Bin Laden were all, some takfiris attempted to assassinate them. Al-Qaeda was not being seen by that crowd as something as religious enough. So what you can tell from both his account as well as the Harmony documents account is that they really came to the decision, the founders, they came to the decision that only jihad is going to work. And those who came to decide on that basis, and those who were actually drafting the documents, they decided that we would only come together on the basis that jihad is the primary reason why we're going to fight. Once you actually want to talk about jihad in the modern state and with violence, then you really need to set yourself against the world order, right? The state has Weber 101. The state has a monopoly over violence. What they really wanted, this is where religiosity comes in. I'm not saying that they are hypocrite or not, that they are religious. No, religion is very, very important. But we need to appreciate when religion matters, to what purpose does it matter, and which part of religiosity do not matter. And that's I think, where Haroun takes us into a specific landscape that takes us into the inside of the jihadi mindset and distinguishes Al-Qaeda from that specific landscape. I hope that answered your question.
Luis Gutierrez from the Latin American Circle of International Studies. A question to Dr. Huckabey. Among the papers you have been studying, have you found any information about the relations or links between Al-Qaeda as an organization and Bin Laden in a personal way with the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and Yumana Mangani? Because I have read that Namangani was Bin Laden's personal representative in Central Asia and the Caucasus. Thank you.
Well, the nature of these collections are you have what you get, and things that you would expect to have found or think are there are not. That's a specific question I was not looking for. There were references to the IMU, that perhaps that was the reason they needed to look so hard in the late 1990s at whether Central Asia and which of the stands there were the best arenas for jihad. There was the big push for Tajikistan, and they felt that there could be some mutual interlinking beneficial ties to what was also going on in Uzbekistan as well. And other than more specific than that, I don't recall anything addressing that.
Anybody else?
This is kind of a broad, general question. My name is Riley Hennessy. I'm from the Canadian Department of National Defense. You talk a lot about religion versus militancy and interesting things today, but I wondered, the topic was, what have we learned since 9/11? And I thought if you could maybe elaborate, what have we learned and how does that help us defeat Al-Qaeda?
Why don't we go down the panel, and maybe if you could say in 2 or 3 sentences or a paragraph, kind of the headline that you take away from that question.
Okay. Well, I mean, as a religious studies scholar, I really and honestly believe that one of the ways to start defeating Al-Qaeda has to do with attacking its ideology and to expose the basic weaknesses that it has with regard to normative Islam. And most especially with regard to its tactics, but overall its strategy as well. Exposing those rifts between Salafis and Sufis is, in my opinion, an excellent way to start off, and exacerbating those things, because I think that those basically appear just about any point where you get Al-Qaeda involving itself in a local struggle, is usually the local population will almost always be Sufi. And or other different forms of Islam that are by their very nature either condemned or hostile to Salafism. So pointing out the doctrinal differences, pointing out the stark version of Islam that will be imposed by these guys when they take power. I mean, just talking in East Africa with people, all you have to do is just say the word Shabab. And they don't want Shabab, just the same way as in North Africa, all you have to do is say Algeria. And even to convinced radicals, they will make a maximum effort to make sure that their methodologies do not involve something that's going around towards the direction of Algeria.
I would say that what you find in the documentary record, and if you also look at their public statements and other conversations, that they're very much what their definition of defeat or failing is. So clearly the ultimate defeat is not having this Islamic State that sends the foothold for greater things, reestablishing the caliphate. But a lot of the things that, well, when we were first studying these writings, we used to pose a question, what would keep them up at night? And now we knew what bin Laden was obsessing about in Abbottabad, I guess. A lot of it is that, yes, that they weren't going to be able to sell this to the larger Ummah, particularly the youth, and they saw this as a very long game, and that you had to have a certain amount of momentum built into this, and you had to keep building upon success and success. And when you kept failing in places and failing to produce operationally, that you were killing your own momentum, even your internal justification for doing this. So just building upon success, which clearly they did not have a record of at that point.
I think, 9/11 was such a traumatic experience for world viewers that in many ways, right after 9/11, when we were trying to kind of make a sense of kind of who were the perpetrators, how do we track them down, what next, we were really kind of caught in the glare of Al-Qaeda's headlights. That is, if Al-Qaeda is a movement, and it was kind of moving before 9/11, it continued to move after, we for a moment were caught in the headlights in the sense that it's directly at us. And obviously, right after 9/11, we needed to answer that question, why us? But part of what's followed after that is realizing that Al-Qaeda was a larger movement that preceded that event, had many victims in its wake before that event, and ensued after and left many more across the world. And so part of, I think, what then we've begun to do is to build knowledge about those different movements in different places and the histories. We've acquired a lot more documents now, and this Conflict Research Records Center is a tremendous example of kind of making documents public that can be sources for interpretation by a wide degree of professionals. It can be sources of dialogue. We can get kind of other countries involved and kind of thinking together about the narrative that we tell and the solutions to that. So I think that's certainly changed.
Two remarks. I think those who are religiously narrow-minded will go after the strategic jihadis like Al-Qaeda. They're never going to be satisfied on the religiosity base that Al-Qaeda is religious enough. They will know that they are not religious enough. So given the certain conditions, I think those that Harun calls them takfiris, they will do harm to Al-Qaeda more than anything else. The other remark is within it from a different perspective. Al-Qaeda's appeal, the rationale for its jihad, was until recently a very appealing, a very rational strategy before the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is actually making all of Al-Qaeda's articles of faith really collapse. The dictators are falling, and they're falling not through jihad, they are falling through peaceful protest. And Al-Qaeda is trying to catch up and is struggling on that front.
Ed Purvis, consultant. What, if anything, does your review of the documents cast any light on the relationship of Al-Qaeda with Iran?
One of the interesting, if I might speak to this audio cassette collection as part of the documents. One of the interesting tapes that I've been working on is called Waqi'una al-Mu'asir by Bin Laden, which means our present reality. And this was delivered in late 1989 or early 1990. And it has recently been released by Yale. Yale has begun to release these audio tapes the last few weeks. So there's presently about 10 of them. Now, what's interesting about this document is Bin Laden has just returned from, the Soviets have been driven out of Afghanistan. He's come back. He's giving his first speech to the Saudis to kind of chart the legacy of like what next, and instead of resting on his laurels, he portrays this kind of encirclement on all sides. And Iran is a major anxiety for him, or at least he first he talks about the Shiites, that they are a major threat to Muslims. Now, this is something that I think scholars of Bin Laden's discourse who've studied his public statements don't find in much of his rhetoric, is kind of outing Iran, because he wants to be a consensus builder and represent himself as kind of, fighting this fight on behalf of all Muslims. But you look back at this early speech, he decries the Shiites, their influence. He decries Saddam and the Baathists. He decries the Egyptian Nasrists, and he decries communists in Yemen. He says all of those, as well as their Christian and Jewish supporters, are assailing the sanctity of Islam in the two holy places, which is Saudi Arabia. So he has a very kind of nationalist kind of pitch in those early years that is just explicitly very anti-Shiite. In the collection, there's a lot of, there are a number of clerics. One is the Kuwaiti cleric, Sheikh Ahmed al-Qattan, who have kind of developed their rhetoric around taking on the Shiites, and it's become a virulent kind of discourse amongst the radical Saudi extremists, and that's certainly there in some of these tapes.
I would just add, yeah, there's, I can't recall any very explicit discussions in the records in this database I looked at, but you do see an undercurrent of the Shia are a very big enemy to be dealt with. There was a reference from the chat from the top of the world that the Arab Mujahideen believe the Shia in Iran were their #1 enemy, and that they would rather target the Sufis and the polytheism that they found in Afghanistan than the Russians. And this was when they're involved in the heat of battle. They still had their eye on problems with what they thought were incorrect views of Islam.
I think with bin Laden's bodies, political, military, theological, and strangely enough, nationalistic. He does refer to the 8th century caliphate. And it's interesting that after the bombing in Madrid, the Wall Street Journal called it the revenge of the Moors. So there's a long, we're going to be back as, not only as a religion, but as a global power to recreate the glories of the past. And it's interesting, the Turks, sometimes Erdogan talks that way. Wow, new Ottoman Empire. And there's a kind of, it's political, it's religious, it's theological, and it's nationalistic. And as a second question, I must confess that I'm a little confused. The connection between jihad, a kind of a military term, and we're at this conference on 9/11, and Sharia. And, people here are authorities on religion. Sharia, my concern about Sharia, can they coexist in a country where they're not the majority? I'm concerned about this. And will they obey our laws? The question that George Washington was, right? Will they obey American laws? Remember, and I'll finish it. A few years ago, this
Okay,
guy,
so
we
get it. The
wife.
question is, as I interpret it,
So there's a Sharia connection, Sharia jihad, and the historical, theological, military, philosophical background of some of the things bin Laden said.
somewhere in there's a question.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to tackle it?
Well, I'll try for your second one there. The connection between jihad and Sharia, I don't think that necessarily Sharia requires any form of jihad, or I don't feel like that the hype that goes around today about the imposition of Sharia is necessarily justified. I think that it can, under certain circumstances, be modified to accommodate the needs of a Muslim minority without being dominationist by its very nature. It can, in cases of Muslim majority, become dominationist, definitely. But I don't think that it necessarily has to. There are enough Muslim thinkers of a modernist bent, definitely in the Western world, and even some in the Middle East as well, that have developed lines of thinking along Sharia that can be fruitful, in my opinion, to allow a Muslim minority to coexist with a majority. So.
Thomas Heghammer, FFI. When the Canadian gentleman asked earlier what we have learned about Al-Qaeda since 9/11, I was struck by the responses, all of which were slightly long and all of which were very different. And I was also sitting there thinking what I would have answered myself, and it would have been something different from the 4 things you heard. So I wonder, have we not made any kind of major, obvious, big discoveries about Al-Qaeda in these 10 years? Maybe not. So could you maybe speak to that? And just as a second question, Peter, could you also try to answer that question? What have we learned about Al-Qaeda since 2001?
Well, I think, don't you think that the argument I presented today is somewhat radical? The idea that, Al-Qaeda, its primary incentive and its ideology is developed through Al-Farouk training camp was primarily directed toward Muslims. That seems to be some distance we've come, toward being able to kind of situate this vehement anti-Americanism that bin Laden, more than any, was very vociferous about in relation to history and debate, even within the movement. As you've written in your book, you very nicely kind of point out those tensions that existed in the movement right up to 2011 about the role of attacking the U.S. and the ways that would or would not figure into explicit kind of ideology and strategy. And you point to certain arguments that call attention to this kind of important socio-revolutionary elements to. So, it seems to me that part of this narrative kind of calls us to, again, as we're looking out to kind of defeat Al-Qaeda, and it continues to be resurgent in places like Yemen. Part of defeating that has got to be some tools for recognizing that when attacks occur against the West and against the United States, as they will in the future, what mechanisms do we have to recognize the allies that we have out there who are Muslims in different communities who have fought and know those actors better than we do in some senses. So it seems to me that we are expanding our arsenal through over time.
I'm going to give an answer through the lens of Haroon, I think. You can sense that he is lamenting the fact that they are losing contacts with one another, losing the central, or what he would call the second-tier leaders, are being captured one after the other, and so on. But at the same time, what seems to have happened in the past 10 years is that Al-Qaeda, the group, may really be losing, but the rise of jihad is actually, now that it's no longer in a position where it could be managed inside Afghanistan, there is a rise of jihad. There is the rise of the irresponsible jihadis, etc., those who are not necessarily as strategic as Al-Qaeda. So there is the pros and the cons. But the Al-Qaeda, the idea, Al-Qaeda, the appeal that appealed to many, I'm not sure that it is the we who are actually trying to make it irrelevant. I do come back to the Arab Spring. I think that is an interesting thing that is happening elsewhere, and it is largely young people on the streets who are actually making a completely different path to that of jihad, making it more credible and tangible, by way of saying why this narrative is no longer as appealing as it once was, why jihad is no longer as appealing. And I have to say, for the past 5 or 6 years, I've read jihadi treaties, I've read jihadi ideologues, and I've always been very impressed by their critique of peace, by their critique of the political process. I've been very impressed by the way they've theorized jihad. at the moment, I am finding them to be quite boring after the Arab Spring. They neither want people to act, they still want to use the rhetoric of jihad, they don't know what it is that they want the jihad to be, and at the same time, they realize that this is problematic, and they are calling on their supporters to exercise restraint. So it's full of rhetoric, but at the end of the day, what is it exactly that you are asking them to do? And I'm just failing to see anything coming out of these texts that is making me being moved this time.
I would just add to that, maybe perhaps it's difficult for us to wrap our minds around the idea of why the global jihad is failing. And we have various issues of how we're trying to characterize that. And that's why I posited that perhaps we can try to nail down a few of why these efforts have failed in certain times and certain places. And you certainly did excellent work on that in the failed jihad in Saudi Arabia, and putting forth the explanations of why that failed there that might be slightly altered from why it struggled in Iraq at a point, or why it never actually took off, or the ebb and flow in various parts. So there might be various answers if we look at break it down into its component parts. But there are some commonalities that they had trouble getting fighters there. They just couldn't sell the message, that they overreached, that the security situation was way too tough. But there are some commonalities between them, but I think it helps sharpen our mind to look at individual cases, as you did.
I mean, I took away from this panel, from Dr. Cook, that essentially Al-Qaeda has lost its religious legitimacy, and from Ms. Huckabey, that sort of encoded in the DNA of every jihadist movement are the seeds of its own defeat, usually because they're killing other Muslims generally, and anybody who doesn't precisely share their views, and that they essentially haven't read their Mao, which is they've never created a popular revolution, or they didn't succeed in creating a popular revolution. I took away from Dr. Lahoud that, in a sense, Al-Qaeda, the organization, is in severe decline. So what does it mean in terms of what we've learned from 9/11 about Al-Qaeda? And I would say the following, that essentially Al-Qaeda is no longer a national security threat to the United States, which suggests that if we have this conference, 10 years from now, it will be very much in a historical, or even 5 years, or whenever we have the next one. Essentially, it's time for us to sort of re-examine a lot of our assumptions about the strength of this movement. I mean, when you've got no significant attack on the West since 7/7, when you've had no attack of any kind by Al-Qaeda for a decade, when you've had only 17 Americans killed by jihadi terrorists in the United States, considerably more since 9/11, more Americans die in their bathtubs by large numbers, and we don't have a rational fear of bathtubs. We should really sort of take this 10-year anniversary and say, this thing is basically done. It's very hard for politicians to say that, because what if they're wrong? But it's a lot easier for people in the room who are all engaged in the national security business in one shape or form to say, maybe it's time to move on from this. The idea that the war on terror should be the principal organizing principle of our national security, it doesn't make any sense at this point. It's factually wrong. And in terms of the one thing that I think has been sort of surprising, to answer Thomas's question, for me personally, I think what's most surprising is the sort of jihadist critique of Al-Qaeda, because it's unpredictable that that they would be getting so much criticism essentially from their right wing. So whether it's Salman al-Lauda or Abdullah Anas or Noman bin Othman, what's really interesting to me, all those criticisms have been greeted by total silence by Al-Qaeda. What are they going to say about Salman al-Lauda? He's not a major religious figure. Of course he is. He's a stooge of the Saudis. Well, he spent a lot of time in Saudi prison. What are they going to say about Abdullah Anas? He's not a major war hero. Well, he fought for 9 years with Massoud. What are they going to say about Noman bin Othman? He's a leader of the Libyan Islamic fighting group, and he's a jihadi war hero. So I think when Al-Qaeda says nothing, and maybe this is a question for the panel, when Al-Qaeda says nothing about these criticisms, what does it mean? Because it seems to me when they don't answer these criticisms, it's because they are really, they have quite a lot of purchase. It's easy for them to say, well, Dr. Fadl's in jail and he's saying these recantations because he's trying to get out of jail. But when they don't respond to these criticisms form of religious scholars or people that they fought with, what does it mean, if anything?
I think what they normally say is that do not listen to the man, listen to the principles, listen to the ideas. And they've been very consistent throughout about these issues. It's just whether the ideas by themselves stand alone or not. People are imperfect, and that's been something that Al-Zawahiri and others have made it quite clear when, and I think Al-Zawahiri, Abu Yahya al-Libi, many of them have actually responded to many of the criticism that's come out, and they just go back to say, okay, here are the principles. Don't listen to any of us. Just listen to whether these points remain valid or not. So that's not to say that I disagree with the fact that it shouldn't be about whether the threat is the same as it was 10 years ago. But I do think that the ideas behind the leaders of Al-Qaeda, the political grievances, these, so long as they continue to remain valid in some parts of the world, I think the ideas behind Al-Qaeda, the narrative, is going to continue to remain valid. In some places, it's being shaken, but in other places, it may not necessarily be as weak as others. And the issue is, terrorism is not about mass movement. You only need a few. Now, to what degree do they have the capacity, capabilities, these things, I can't really comment on. But if I were to go back to Haroun once again, he's spent most of his time in Somalia training people. He saw it. This is part of the DNA of Al-Qaeda. They get up, they arrive at a place, they set up shop, they start training camps. And he's been doing quite a lot of that. I don't know any of his proteges. They may emerge, they may not. I think the threat is both. It's very interesting to think about having many of the leaders being eliminated, but at the same time, there is the unpredictability of certain things that we don't necessarily have a grasp on, and unfortunately, we don't have too many of the documents, and unfortunately, the CIA isn't, or whoever, they're not releasing as soon as possible the materials in Osama bin Laden's compound. So it'd be nice for us to.
I think that's coming to a movie house near you very soon.
Thank you. That would be fun.
In quite some detail. Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm Veronica Belenkai. I have a quick question. In all of your research, have you come across anything that might suggest any kind of sincere contemplation as to what would have happened if any of their demands may have been satisfied, if the U.S. retrenches from Israel? Or is this kind of a very hypothetical thing that they publicly put out in PR messaging? Thank you.
So is there anything in the documents that talks about what happens if their demands are satisfied? Is that the question? Yeah. Well, one of their demands was satisfied immediately, which was, relatively recently, was the U.S. essentially drawdown from Saudi Arabia. And as far as I'm aware, there's never been any. That was, after all, bin Laden's principal gripe against the United States. He's never recognized it publicly. Has he ever recognized it privately that we're aware of? That would suggest that he's not an easily satisfied individual. Okay, over here.
Mark Stout, Johns Hopkins University. Excellent panel, and I applaud Peter for jumping in, and I applaud Thomas for getting Peter to jump in. I think all of you, all five of you, have suggested that at the moment Al-Qaeda and the jihadist movement within which it's embedded is not doing very well, and almost all of you, with the possible exception of David Cook, said that, and by the way, its past isn't so great either. This is analysis with which I completely agree, but I just sort of want to test in my own mind sort of the strength of this analysis and ask you to think about sort of the opposite question of, is there any case to be made at all that isn't intellectually ridiculous that things are going well, or I think I know the answer to that. We'll just back it off a little bit. Are there any aspects of this struggle the jihadists are engaged in that are at least going adequately well from their point of view? Is there any good or even acceptable news in where we stand now from the jihadist point of view? Or is this utter downfall and ruin that we're seeing from them that we're seeing unfolding at the moment?
The country I'm most familiar with is Yemen. Al-Qaeda in places like Abyan, which has announced its kind of, territorial reclamation and so forth of certain parts of Abyan. Right, so that kind of follows during a period in which Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president, has been shaken, his throne shaken, and his literally. The folks in the south, now this is the same area that was once radically communist, like as far, left as you could go in the Arab world, Abyan. So, working like peasants and shepherds and people who took Mao very seriously in the 70s. It's the same exact town in the same areas that had formerly made that their playing card. So here they are again, revisiting a moment in which this dictator in their eyes is losing the seat, and what vocabulary do they have to reach world audiences and make themselves appear threatening? And Al-Qaeda is a brand name. It's a brand name that works, particularly because it's the United States' role with Ali Abdullah Saleh that is at stake here, and in many people's views, it's the U.S. role in Yemen. Given kind of the last number of years of the U.S. commitment to Ali Abdullah Saleh.